They say you can't take it with you, but when Charles Stanley passed away, it turns out what he left behind was so enormous, it didn't just shock his fans, it shook his own family to the core. Behind the soft-spoken sermons and the decades-long ministry, the beloved pastor had quietly built an empire, one so vast, insiders say it rivals the fortunes of Hollywood's elite. But here's the twist. The size of the inheritance wasn't just unexpected, it was life-changing. So much so, sources close to the family say there were tears when the will was read, not from grief, but from sheer disbelief. What exactly did Charles Stanley leave behind? Who's cashing in and who's being left out? When Charles Stanley died at the age of 90, the world mourned the loss of a spiritual giant. Millions knew him as the soft-spoken Southern preacher whose sermons reached living rooms across the globe for over 5 decades. He was a man of faith, a pillar of wisdom, and for many, a moral compass in chaotic times. But what few realized until now is that behind the pulpit and beyond the prayers, Dr. Stanley was also quietly building something else, something far more worldly. A hidden empire, a financial legacy so vast, so meticulously constructed, that even his closest family members didn't fully grasp its scale until it was time to divide it. And that's where the story takes a dramatic turn. Sources close to the family described the moment the will was read as nothing short of jaw-dropping. There were tears, but not only the kind you expect after the death of a patriarch. Some were tears of shock. Others, according to insiders, came from sheer disbelief. One person reportedly whispered, "This can't be real." Another, simply stunned, sat silently for minutes. Because what Charles Stanley left behind wasn't just a modest estate from decades in ministry. It was a fortune that rivaled entertainment moguls, tech entrepreneurs, even A-list celebrities. And the real question now, who's getting what? And who, if anyone, was left with nothing? What's buried inside Charles Stanley's financial legacy? How did a humble preacher accumulate such staggering wealth? And what does this mean for the future of his family, his followers, and the empire he left behind? Before the fortune, before the headlines, and long before the tears at the reading of his will, Charles Stanley was simply the voice. Calm, measured, unshakably composed. For decades, he guided millions through moments of uncertainty, heartbreak, and doubt with the power of a single phrase: obey God and leave all the consequences to Him. That was the cornerstone of his ministry. But what few people ever realized was that Stanley wasn't just building a church, he was building a brand. Born in rural Virginia during the Great Depression, Charles Stanley came from humble beginnings. He started preaching at just 14 years old, driven by conviction and grit. By 1971, he became the senior pastor of First Baptist Church Atlanta, a congregation he would eventually transform into one of the most influential megachurches in the country. But that was just the beginning. In 1977, Stanley founded In Touch Ministries, a media company disguised as a ministry and the true engine behind his rise to global influence. His sermons were syndicated to radio stations, then to television networks, and eventually streamed around the world. At its peak, In Touch reached more than 115 million households every single week. That's not just a congregation, that's a media empire. But Stanley wasn't flashy. He didn't live in a Beverly Hills mansion or drive Ferraris. His wealth wasn't flaunted. It was layered, calculated, and quietly accumulated. Book royalties, speaking engagements, licensing deals, and intellectual property rights all funneled into a growing network of revenue streams. Financial experts now estimate that In Touch Ministries alone generated tens of millions of dollars annually over the years, largely tax-exempt. And yet, the image he projected never changed. To his followers, Charles Stanley was the epitome of humility, a man whose success was rooted in faith, not finance. But here's where it gets interesting. Stanley was no ordinary pastor. He understood distribution, brand equity, and audience engagement long before most televangelists caught on. He negotiated media contracts like a seasoned executive. He retained rights to his sermons. And he invested in infrastructure that would outlive him. Behind the pulpit, he was preaching to the faithful. Behind the scenes, He was building generational wealth. This is the side of Charles Stanley the public never saw, until now. And as we peel back the layers of his empire, the real question becomes, how much of this legacy was spiritual and how much of it was strategic? For most families, the death of a patriarch brings grief, reflection, maybe even reconciliation. But for the Stanley family, it brought something else entirely: questions, whispers, and for some, according to one insider, stunned silence. Because when it came time to open Charles Stanley's will, what was revealed didn't just catch people off guard, it changed everything. Let's start with the most obvious name: Andy Stanley, Charles's son, and a pastor in his own right. As the founder of North Point Ministries, Andy had long stepped out of his father's shadow, creating a more modern, sometimes controversial version of Christian leadership. Though they shared the same calling, their philosophies didn't always align. In fact, Charles reportedly opposed Andy's more seeker-friendly, church style, and the two had what some close to the family describe as a strained but respectful relationship for years. So when the will was read, many assumed Andy would inherit the lion's share of his father's empire. After all, who better to carry the torch? But sources close to the proceedings say the actual distribution was far more complicated and in some ways unexpected. While Andy was reportedly named in the will, and did receive what one source called a meaningful portion, he did not receive full control over In Touch Ministries, nor the entire financial estate. Instead, Charles Stanley had structured his assets through a web of trusts, charitable foundations, and legacy clauses that divided control among several parties, including church board members, longtime ministry staff, and key advisors. Some of these individuals had worked with him for decades, and according to those familiar with the arrangements, Stanley believed they were essential to preserving his spiritual legacy. And then there were the omissions. At least one extended family member, whose name has not been publicly released, was reportedly left out of the will entirely, leading to private speculation and, potentially, legal tension. Another relative, described as a distant cousin with closer ties in recent years, is said to have received a surprisingly generous bequest, raising eyebrows within the family circle. According to one family friend, there were definitely moments in that room where people looked around like, did he really just leave that to them? Another source added, there was love in that room, but also shock. Like some people realized they didn't know Charles as well as they thought. And then there's the emotional layer, the personal notes. True to form, Charles Stanley reportedly included handwritten letters to a handful of key figures in his life, including his children, spiritual mentors, and a few unnamed confidants. The content of those letters remains private, but one recipient described it as more meaningful than anything money could buy. Still, for others, it was hard not to focus on the numbers. Insiders say the estate included multiple real estate holdings, some under his name, others under church-owned LLCs, along with media rights, investment portfolios, and the crown jewel, the full intellectual property rights to decades of recorded sermons, estimated to be worth millions in syndication value alone. And yet, despite all the structure, all the foresight, and all the planning, there's one thing Charles Stanley couldn't control: how the people he left behind would feel. Some saw the will as wise. Others felt overlooked. And for a family whose public image was built on faith, humility, and unity, the cracks, however small, were beginning to show. Because this wasn't just about money. It was about legacy, about whose name gets remembered, and about whether spiritual wealth and financial fortune can ever truly coexist without tension. For decades, Charles Stanley stood behind a pulpit, speaking of eternity, morality, and the importance of living humbly before God. But behind that calm voice and timeless message was something most people never realized: a financial ecosystem so powerful, so well-structured, it would rival that of major corporate CEOs. The empire he left behind wasn't accidental. It was the result of decades of strategy, structure, and quiet accumulation. So, how big was the fortune? According to estate insiders and financial analysts familiar with religious media, the value of Charles Stanley's estate is estimated between $25 million and $40 million, but that's just the conservative estimate. Others believe the number could be significantly higher, depending on how certain assets are classified. And remember, that doesn't even include non-liquid assets or protected church holdings. Let's break it down. At the center of his empire was In Touch Ministries, the organization Stanley founded in 1977. On paper, it's a nonprofit. In reality, it operated more like a faith-based production house, with tentacles in television, radio, podcasting, international broadcasting, publishing, and digital streaming. It wasn't just spreading the word, it was monetizing it effectively and legally. Each week, In Touch programming aired in over 115 million households across more than 100 countries, translated into dozens of languages. That global reach brought in millions in donations, but also created a secondary goldmine: intellectual property. Charles Stanley retained rights to his sermons, books, and licensed media content. These sermons, once broadcast, became syndicated programming, meaning networks paid to air them again and again. The estimated residual value of these recordings alone? Over $10 million. That includes licensing, reprint deals, and long-tail digital distribution rights. Then, there are the book royalties. Stanley authored more than 60 books, many of them bestsellers in the Christian publishing world. Titles like How to Listen to God, In Touch with God, and Success God's Way have sold millions of copies over the years. Experts estimate his royalty earnings were as high as $500,000 to $1 million per year during peak publishing years, with some of those deals still active in perpetuity. Add to that his real estate portfolio, which includes a private home in Atlanta, located in one of the city's most exclusive zip codes, valued at over $2.5 million. Several ministry-owned properties used for production and office space, many of which sit on prime commercial land, and smaller investments in surrounding areas, held under subsidiary LLCs with strong ties to the ministry. And let's not forget the investment accounts. While not much is publicly disclosed, sources familiar with the estate say Stanley was financially conservative but savvy, investing heavily in index funds, church bonds, and high-yield charitable trusts. At the time of his death, his private portfolio, distinct from ministry assets, was said to be valued in the low eight figures, much of it sheltered in donor-advised funds and strategic trusts designed to minimize estate taxes. But perhaps the most fascinating part of Charles Stanley's wealth? How protected it is. Unlike entertainers or influencers, religious figures often benefit from a tax-advantaged structure, especially when earnings come through non-profit vehicles. Stanley's use of irrevocable trusts, clergy housing allowances, and charitable gift annuities meant that much of his fortune will transfer to beneficiaries with minimal tax exposure. In plain terms, the IRS won't be getting a huge chunk of it. And yet, even with all this preparation, all this wealth, there's still uncertainty about how it will be managed moving forward. In Touch Ministries remains operational, but with its founder gone, leadership has shifted. Some insiders worry about long-term stability. Others see opportunity, especially with the digital archive of Charles Stanley's life work now positioned to grow in value over time. There's even talk of a documentary deal already in the early planning stages, which could breathe new financial life into the brand and possibly bring old tensions back to the surface. Because when a man of faith dies with the fortune of a Fortune 500 CEO, questions will always follow. Who profits from his legacy? Who protects it? And when money and ministry mix, can anything truly remain sacred? Charles Stanley may be gone, but what he left behind is still unfolding, and in many ways, just beginning to take shape. Because when a man builds both a spiritual movement and a media empire, the real story doesn't end at the funeral. It begins at the power shift. For decades, Stanley was the singular voice and vision behind In Touch Ministries, its teacher, its brand, and its shield. Every sermon, every interview, every decision ran through him. But now, with that guiding presence gone, the question is no longer, what did he leave behind? It's who gets to decide what happens next? That question has already sparked quiet but consequential changes. Leadership at In Touch Ministries has shifted to a board of trustees and longtime executives, many of whom were handpicked by Stanley himself. On paper, they're the stewards of his vision. But off the record, sources say tensions are rising behind the scenes between those who want to preserve Stanley's traditional voice and others who believe the ministry must evolve or risk irrelevance in an age of digital-first spirituality. One former employee described the internal vibe as calm on the surface, conflicted underneath. Another added, there are people who believe Charles Stanley was the brand, and without him, the engine stops running. And then there's the family. While Charles Stanley's son, Andy, has maintained a public posture of grace and privacy, his absence from direct control of In Touch Ministries has raised eyebrows. Despite leading one of the largest church networks in America, North Point Ministries, Andy's theological and stylistic differences with his father were well documented over the years. They had respect, but they had distance. Will Andy play a role in shaping his father's legacy from here? Or will he let it evolve without interference, focusing on his own path? Those close to the family say the answer isn't clear, even to him. But the impact of Charles Stanley's estate reaches far beyond just bloodlines and boardrooms. It touches millions of people who tuned in weekly, read his books, donated to his causes, and built their faith through his voice. So, what happens now to them? Already, In Touch Ministries is rolling out legacy content, archived sermons repackaged with new intros, digitally enhanced for modern platforms. There's talk of an official Charles Stanley Archive app, streaming his entire catalog of messages, devotionals, and daily reflections. The move could both preserve his teachings and generate millions in passive revenue, especially with younger Christian audiences consuming more faith content online. But not everyone is cheering. Critics argue that the ministry risks turning into a Christian Netflix, focused more on branding and monetization than spiritual formation. Others worry that doctrinal drift could occur without Stanley's hand at the helm, especially if new leadership begins updating messaging to reflect modern social values. And then, of course, there's the matter of money. With tens of millions at stake, including an estate tied up in charitable trusts and licensing rights, several parties, from advisors to former associates, are rumored to be watching closely. One media analyst put it bluntly, whenever there's an empire, there's always the risk of empire builders. Translation? People may begin stepping into shape, or reshape, Charles Stanley's legacy for reasons that aren't always spiritual. And yet, even amid the complexity, there is one undeniable truth. His influence isn't fading. If anything, it's crystallizing. Charles Stanley may no longer be here, but his voice continues, on TV, online, and in the minds of millions who grew up hearing his sermons every Sunday. The real question is no longer about inheritance. It's about interpretation. Who gets to define what Charles Stanley stood for? Who decides how his teachings are applied in a world that's changed since his heyday? And what happens when a spiritual figure becomes a brand, etched in media, frozen in archives, and held in the hands of people who never truly knew the man behind the message? Because in the end, Charles Stanley didn't just leave behind a will or a fortune. He left behind a question, one the world is still trying to answer.